Commander Zextral stood at the observation deck of the Kepler Petrel 7, watching the derelict vessel rotate slowly against the backdrop of distant stars. The ship was old, impossibly old. According to the carbon dating analyses his team had run, it had been drifting through space for at least 300 years. The Vexstar had been exploring the Crimson Expanse for half that time, and never once had they encountered anything like this. "The atmosphere readings are stable," called out Lyra, one of the junior science officers. Her iridescent skin flickered with shades of blue and purple, a sign she was nervous. Everyone on this mission was nervous. The Crimson Expanse was not a forgiving place. Space itself seemed to hold malice here, with radiation storms that appeared without warning and gravitational anomalies that could tear a ship apart in seconds. Zextral's four eyes focused on the derelict. The vessel's hull was a dull metallic grey, scarred by micrometeorites and the passage of centuries. Strange symbols ran along its side, characters in a language he did not recognize. That alone was extraordinary. The Vextar, as the most advanced civilization in this region of space, had made it their business to know every language, every cultural marker of every species that inhabited this part of the galaxy. Yet this symbol was foreign to every database in his possession. Life signs? Zextral asked, his antennae twitching slightly. It was a habit when he was thinking deeply. "That is unusual, Commander," replied Kesh, the medical officer. Kesh was a Threll, a species known for their exceptional analytical abilities. His three-fingered hand moved across the holographic display, and mathematical models bloomed in the air before him. The sensors are detecting one biological signature, just one, but the readings are inconsistent. Inconsistent how? Zextral turned away from the window. The metabolic rate is low. The cellular structure appears to be in a state of suspended animation, but the methodology is foreign to us. There are also signs of what appear to be medical devices integrated with the biological form, though they are primitive by our standards. The most peculiar aspect is the genetic structure. I've never seen anything like it. The commander approached the display, his antennae straightening in interest. His antennae never lied. They always told him when something was wrong, when the universe was throwing him a puzzle he was not equipped to solve. Right now, they were practically vibrating with anticipation. "A rescue mission," suggested Lyra hopefully. "Someone in desperate need of help. We could bring them aboard, resuscitate them in our medical bay. The Alliance would commend us for saving a life." Zextral considered this. The Alliance did value life, especially the conservation of potentially rare or extinct species. There had been incidents throughout history of civilizations vanishing, leaving behind only ghosts and ruins. Perhaps this was another case. Perhaps they could be heroes. "Prepare the extraction team," he ordered. "Use the standard biocontainment protocols. If this being has survived 3 centuries, we need to understand what that means. It could be dangerous. It could also be invaluable." The next 6 hours passed in meticulous preparation. The medical team assembled the suspension pod, the device they would use to carefully extract the hibernating being without damaging whatever ancient systems kept it alive. The security team armed themselves with standard-issue plasma rifles, though Zextral privately thought it was unlikely they would need them. Whatever was in that ship had been asleep for hundreds of years. It probably did not even remember how to be conscious. When the airlock door of the derelict finally hissed open, releasing a cloud of perfectly preserved stale air, the extraction team moved with practiced efficiency. The ship inside was dark. Emergency lighting flickered on as their scanners activated the dormant systems, revealing corridors of surprising simplicity. Everything about this vessel seemed wrong. The technology was too basic, the design too crude. It reminded Zextral of the earliest experiments in space travel, the primitive attempts of civilizations just learning how to escape their planetary cradles. The life sign was coming from a central chamber. The team followed the signal deeper into the ship, their breathing synchronized, their weapons at ready. The atmosphere was breathable, just barely. Zextral could smell the staleness of it, the weight of undisturbed air. Then they found the chamber. It was a control room of sorts, though far simpler than anything the Vextar used. Banks of screens lined the walls, all dark except for one small indicator light that blinked steadily, like a heartbeat. And there, suspended in a pod of clear fluid, was the being. Zextral's antennae froze. Everything in his training, everything in his experience as a seasoned space explorer, everything in his genetic memory screamed at him that this should not be possible. The creature before him was not scaled, not chitinous, not crystalline. It had smooth skin of a warm tan color, and only two eyes. Two that were closed in sleep. It had a form that was disturbingly familiar, and yet completely alien to him. "Commander," whispered Keish, his voice barely audible. "That genetic structure. I am running a comparison with historical records. The Vexstar archives contain references to a species that supposedly went extinct approximately 10,000 years ago. A species that consumed entire star systems, that weaponized their own biology, that what?" Zextral found his voice was steady, even though his antennae told a different story. That the entire galaxy united to destroy. The room went perfectly, absolutely silent. The being in the pod showed no signs of waking. Its chest rose and fell with mechanical regularity. Its heart beat in a rhythm that was strange but persistent. Around its temples, thin metallic filaments extended into its skull, interfacing with what appeared to be some kind of biological computer interface. "Commander!" came Lyra's voice over the communication system. "We are reading unusual energy fluctuations in the ship's core systems. Something is." The lights on the banks of inactive screens suddenly burst to life, flooding the chamber with harsh white light. Alarms began to sound. Soft, gentle alarms. Nothing like the urgent warnings of Vexstar technology. These alarms seemed almost quaint, almost desperate. Holographic text appeared in a language none of them recognized. The medical readouts changed. The being in the pod stirred. "We need to leave," Keish said urgently. "Now. If this is truly what I think it is, we should not be here when it wakes." But Zextral could not move. He was transfixed, watching as the creature's eyes began to flutter. Watching as the ancient hibernation pod cycled through its final protocols. Watching as the impossible became real. The pod drained. The fluid that had preserved the being for 300 years cascaded away into recycling systems that should have been non-functional but somehow still worked. The being's eyes opened. They were a bright blue color, like the sky of some lost world, and they fixed directly on Zextral with an intelligence and awareness that was both shocking and terrible. The creature breathed, a long, shuddering breath that filled the sudden silence with the sound of something returning to life. Its mouth moved, and words came out in a language that was ancient, liquid, and somehow, impossibly, understood by the translation algorithms of every single device in the room. "How long?" the creature asked, and its voice was soft, female, and achingly alone. "How long have I been asleep?" Zextral's antennae trembled. His four eyes locked with those two blue ones, and in that moment, he knew that everything was about to change. 300 years. He said slowly, approximately. The creature laughed. It was a sound like breaking glass, like hope dying, like the end of an era. 300? The being pulled herself up in the pod, and Zextral saw her fully for the first time. Her form was bipedal, with 2 arms and 2 legs. Her face held a beauty that transcended species, but seemed to speak directly to something ancient in his DNA. "That is much longer than I expected, but not as long as I feared." She looked at them, really looked at them, and her expression shifted. Her eyes went wide, her mouth opened. "You are not human," she breathed. "None of you are human. Where am I? What year is it? What happened to Earth?" The room fell silent once more, but this time, it was a silence loaded with the weight of histories, with the gravity of civilizations meeting across the void of time. "I am sorry," Zextral said carefully, "but I do not understand your reference. You come from a place called Earth?" The creature climbed out of the pod with surprising strength, given that she had been asleep for centuries. Her balance was perfect, almost as if she had never stopped using those limbs. She looked at him, and he saw something in her expression that he recognized. He had seen it once before, in the historical records of the last survivors of a dying world. It was the look of someone who had just realized they were the last of their kind. "Yes," she said quietly, "I come from Earth. And She stopped, turning slowly to look at each of them in turn. "You don't know what that means, do you? You don't know what I am. We have theories," Keish offered from the doorway. "None of them are good." The creatures smiled, and it was the saddest thing any of them had ever seen. "My name is Dr. Sarah Chen," she said. And I am the last human being in the known universe. Now, before you do anything drastic, I think we should talk. Because if I understand the age of this technology correctly, your people don't have very much time, and neither do I. Dr. Sarah Chen sat in the observation room of the Kepler task. 7. A cup of something warm in her hands that approximated coffee. The Vexstar had synthesized it based on her descriptions, pulling the recipe from historical records and her own genetic memory. It was not quite right. Nothing would be quite right ever again, but it was close enough to bring unexpected tears to her eyes. Commander Zextral stood on the other side of the transparent barrier, watching her with an intensity that suggested he was cataloging every micro-expression, every involuntary movement. Behind him, Kesh reviewed data on holographic displays, occasionally glancing back at her with something that might have been fear or fascination, or both. Your species was extinct 10,000 years ago, Kesh said carefully, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for nearly an hour. According to the Unified Historical Database, humans were responsible for the extinction of 17 civilizations, the enslavement of 32 more, and the consumption of resources from over 200 star systems before the Alliance united against you. Sarah set down her cup with meticulous care. She had known this was coming. She had lived with the knowledge of what her people had done, what she had done, since the moment she had begun to understand the implications of human expansion. But hearing it from an alien who spoke of those atrocities as simple fact, without judgment or emotion, somehow made it all the more terrible. Yes, she said simply. That is the history you were told. I wonder if you would like to hear the actual history. That would be illuminating, Zextral said. He moved closer to the barrier, his 4 eyes focusing on her with extraordinary intensity. Enlighten us. Explain how a species condemned to extinction, supposedly destroyed utterly in the Purification Wars, could still exist 300 years ago, sleeping in a derelict vessel at the edge of a dead space. Sarah closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she seemed suddenly ancient, as if the weight of centuries had caught up to her all at once. Humans are adaptive, she began. That is not a metaphor. We are not the fastest or the strongest or the smartest species in the universe. We are not particularly gifted at any single thing, but we are adaptive. We survive. We find ways to continue even when the odds are impossible. It is in our bones, in our DNA. My people settled thousands of worlds because we could survive anywhere. We thrived in ways that other species did not. Some of us were cruel. Some of us were destructive. But most of us were simply trying to survive, trying to give our children a future. You consumed worlds, Kesh said flatly. You stripped them of resources with no regard for indigenous populations. Yes, Sarah acknowledged, and that was a crime, a terrible crime. But it was not genocide, not originally. Humanity did not intend to destroy other civilizations. We did not even know they were there. Most of the time we were arrogant, ignorant, and yes, brutal. But we were not the monsters you believe us to be. Or rather, we were no more monstrous than any other species that seeks to expand, to grow, to claim territory. She stood and walked to the barrier. Her reflection stared back at her from the transparent surface, a woman who looked no older than 35, but who carried the weight of someone 10,000 years old. The Purification Wars happened because the Alliance was afraid, Sarah continued. I cannot blame them for that. A species expanding at the rate humans were, consuming resources, adapting to any environment, refusing to die despite every attempt to contain them. Yes, that is terrifying. So the Alliance united. They sent a fleet unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, and they destroyed my people. But not all of you, Zextral observed. You survived. A very small number survived, Sarah corrected. Thousands, perhaps, out of trillions. Humanity went from the dominant species in this region of space to whispers, rumors, ghosts. The survivors scattered. They went into hiding. Some of them, the ones who believed humanity could still have a future, they began a project. They called it the Ark Initiative. It was a series of vessels, each containing a selection of humans, carefully chosen for genetic diversity, for knowledge, for skills that might be useful in rebuilding. Each ship was sent in a different direction, equipped with the best hibernation technology we could create. The idea was that one day, far in the future, when the fear had faded, when the Alliance had moved on to other concerns, humans could wake up. We could find each other. We could try again. Keish's three-fingered hand moved frantically across his display, a dispersal strategy. Brilliant and desperate. How many vessels were constructed? 7, Sarah said. I was on the 7th. We launched from a hidden station near what you probably call the Crimson Expanse. I was a genetic engineer, one of the architects of the hibernation technology. I volunteered to stay awake as long as possible to monitor the systems, to wake if something went wrong. I expected to wake once every century, check on the others, maintain the ship systems, and go back to sleep. But something went wrong, Zextral said. Everything went wrong, Sarah agreed. About 200 years into the journey, our systems began to fail. Not catastrophically. The redundancies kept us alive, but enough that I knew we would not make it to our destination intact. I tried to contact the other vessels, no response. I tried to navigate to any known human settlement. None existed in the records. I searched for any transmission, any signal that would indicate humanity still existed anywhere in the galaxy. She turned away from the barrier, unable to meet their eyes. There was nothing, she whispered. Just silence, endless silence. So I put myself into deep hibernation, set the ship's systems to wake me if anything changed, and prayed that someday someone would find us. I prayed that somewhere humanity still existed, that I was not the last, that I was not watching the final moments of a species that had once dreamed of colonizing the stars. The observation room was absolutely quiet. The Vexstar monitoring equipment hummed softly in the background, the only sound in the weight of that revelation. You have been searching the database, Sarah said, looking back at Zextral. I can see it in the way you are standing, in the angle of those antennae. You have found something. We have, Kesh confirmed. There are records in the oldest sections of the Unified Historical Database, in files that have not been accessed in over 5,000 years. Reports of an encounter 7,000 years ago with a species the records call the Terrans. According to these files, the Terrans asked for peace. They proposed an alliance, a mutual non-aggression pact. They offered to limit their expansion in exchange for recognition of their territorial claims. And Sarah's voice was barely audible. And the alliance rejected them. Kesh said quietly, the decision was made to eradicate them entirely, to make sure they could never rise again. Your species was sentenced to extinction not because they were irredeemable, but because the alliance was afraid of what they might become. Sarah sat down heavily. She suddenly looked very tired. All those lives, she murmured. All those trillions of people. For nothing. Because of fear. Yes, Zextral said, and there was something almost like sympathy in his 4 eyes. And now we face a problem. Because if the truth were to become known, that humans were not the monsters we were taught, that they were victims of a coordinated genocide based on fear and prejudice, it would shake the foundations of the Kepler Collective. The alliance itself was founded on the principle of the righteous extermination of your kind. If that principle is questioned, everything else is questioned as well. You are going to kill me, Sarah said. It was not a question. That would certainly be the simplest solution, Kesh agreed. We report nothing. We return you to hibernation or destroy the ship entirely. We maintain the historical narrative. The alliance remains stable. But, Sarah asked, because she could hear something in his tone, some unspoken reservation. Zextral moved to the barrier and placed his 4-fingered hand against the transparent surface. When he spoke, his voice was soft but filled with a strange kind of urgency. But we are a young species, Dr. Chen. Young enough that we have not yet learned to be truly comfortable with our own place in the galaxy. Young enough that we still question the decisions of our elders. And I have come to believe in the past hour, that hiding the truth would make us complicit in what the Alliance has already done. It would make us party to genocide. That is not who I want to be, Commander, Kesh said urgently. If you disclose this information, it will spark conflict. The older species will not tolerate a challenge to the historical record. They will not accept that their greatest achievement, the extermination of humanity, was a moral wrong. Then we will need to be very careful, Zextral said, and we will need to be very clever. Because, Dr. Chen, I believe you were right when you said we do not have very much time. For either of us. What do you mean? Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate. She could see something shift in Zextral's expression. Something that suggested he had been holding something back. Come, he said. Let me show you something. Let me show you what the data really says about the Kepler Collective. Let me show you why humanity's return is not just a historical issue, it is a harbinger. It is a sign that something is coming, something that will force all of us, human and alien alike, to face a future far more dangerous than we imagined. As Zextral led her deeper into the ship, Sarah could not shake the feeling that she had awakened not to a chance at redemption, but to a crisis that would define not just the fate of her species, but the fate of every sentient being in the galaxy. The room had fallen silent when they discovered what she was, but the silence that was coming would be far, far louder. And in the darkness of space, vast shapes moved toward the Kepler expanse, entities ancient and hungry, drawn by the faintest of signals, a signal that Dr. Sarah Chen's awakening had sent out before anyone even knew to listen for it. The universe itself was about to wake up, and nothing would ever be the same again. The data center of the Kepler 7 was a cathedral of light and information. Holographic displays spiraled through three-dimensional space, creating a mathematical landscape that only the most advanced minds could navigate. Zextral moved through this landscape with fluid grace, his antennae extended to their full length, reading information on neural wavelengths that Sarah could not even perceive. Kesh worked beside him, his three-fingered hands manipulating data with a precision that bordered on artistic. Sarah stood at the center of this display, watching as 10,000 years of galactic history unfolded around her. This is the migration pattern, Zextral explained, directing her attention to a sweeping arc of light that moved through galactic coordinates like a predator's path. We began detecting these 17 years ago. At first, we believed it was an anomaly in our sensors. Then we thought it was a natural phenomenon, perhaps a rogue star cluster, perhaps some kind of exotic matter we had not encountered before. But as the data accumulated, the pattern became clear. Something massive is moving through the galaxy, something conscious, something deliberately making its way toward the core worlds of the Kepler Collective. Sarah watched the arc of light move across the display, and her genetic memory began to supply context her conscious mind had not yet fully processed. The others, she breathed. No, it is not possible. The others were destroyed thousands of years ago. We, humanity, we fought them. We lost others. Cash looked up from his display. Your records contain information about these entities? Not records, Sarah said slowly. Nightmares. Stories that parents told their children to frighten them into obedience. The others were the precursor species, the ones who existed before even the oldest civilizations in the Alliance. They consumed everything. They did not colonize worlds or strip them of resources. They consumed them entirely. Matter, energy, consciousness itself, all fed into their collective hunger. Humanity was not the first species to encounter them, but we were one of the few who survived contact. We did not defeat them. We just learned to hide from them. We learned to make our presence as small as possible, to avoid their notice. And you believe this migration pattern is them? Zextral's four eyes fixed on her with terrible intensity. You believe the others are returning? I believe, Sarah said carefully, that something is returning. Something that has slept in the deep spaces between galaxies for thousands of years. And I believe that whatever it is following the scent of the signal your ship sent when you activated my hibernation pod. The observation center fell into stunned silence. This silence was different from the others. This was the silence of worlds facing their final days. This was the silence of civilizations recognizing extinction. How long? Zextral asked. 73 years based on current trajectories, Kesh said, his voice hollow. Possibly less if it accelerates. And there is no technology in the current collective arsenal that could stop something like that. It would require the combined efforts of every advanced species in this region of space. It would require a unified alliance, and we cannot even agree on how to share resources. The older species will never believe us, Zextral said grimly. They have ruled the galaxy for so long that they have forgotten how to fear. They have forgotten that there are things in the dark that are far older and more terrible than themselves. Then we make them believe, Sarah said. Something hard had crystallized in her voice, something that came from a place deep inside her, the part of her that had been human when humanity mattered, when her people had the will to fight back against impossible odds. We go to them. We present the evidence. And if they will not listen, we find another way. How? Kesh asked. What alternative could possibly exist if the Alliance will not unite? If the older species will not mobilize their forces, then we are finished. All of us. Sarah turned to face them directly. You are thinking about this wrong. You were thinking like species that had never had to adapt to survive. You were thinking like beings who have always had enough resources, enough time, enough security. You are thinking like the Alliance. But humanity survived in a galaxy that was hostile to our very existence. We learned things that the comfortable civilizations have forgotten. What things? Zextral moved closer, his antennae practically vibrating now. How to fight, Sarah said. How to adapt in the face of the impossible. How to take the weapons and tools of our enemies and turn them into something new. How to inspire loyalty and sacrifice in beings who have nothing left to lose. The others are not truly unstoppable, Commander. They are just very, very hungry. They consume because that is what they are programmed to do. But they are not flexible. They do not improvise. They do not do the unexpected. And humans do? Keish asked quietly. Humans excel at it, Sarah said. It is the only advantage we ever had. When we could not be stronger or faster or smarter, we found ways to be cleverer. We found ways to survive that the universe told us were impossible. And if you want to fight the others, you will need that. You will need that adaptive, stubborn, relentless human willingness to keep trying no matter how many times we fail. Zextral's four eyes locked with her too. Are you volunteering, Dr. Chen? After everything the galaxy did to your people, after we nearly hunted you to extinction, you would volunteer to save us? Not to save you, Sarah corrected. To save the future. Because even if I wanted revenge, and I won't lie and tell you I do not, because I do, revenge is pointless if there is no one left to see it. The Alliance may be old and arrogant and terribly wrong about many things, but it is not irredeemable. And its people, whatever their species, do not deserve to be consumed by the others because their leaders were too proud to listen. Over the next 72 hours, Zextral and Sarah crafted a plan that was equal parts audacious and desperate. Case used his analytical abilities to model different scenarios, testing their strategies against the best estimates of the others' behavior patterns. The data that emerged was not encouraging. Even in the best-case scenarios, the cost would be astronomical. But in every scenario where nothing was done, the outcome was extinction. The first challenge was getting the Council of Elders to take them seriously. The Kepler-7 sent its transmission to the core worlds, a complete data package containing Sarah's testimony, historical records, Keisha's analysis, and direct evidence of the approaching others. The response was exactly what Zextral had predicted. The Council dismissed it as a hoax, a conspiracy, an elaborate fraud. Some members suggested it was an attempt by younger species to gain power and prestige. Others speculated that the Kepler-7 had been infiltrated by enemies of the collective. One particularly virulent statement from the Grand Vizier of the Thelkar suggested that this was clearly evidence that the Vexthar were genetically inferior and should be removed from the Council entirely. But not everyone dismissed it. To Zextral's surprise, it was younger species that began to take the warning seriously. The Krell, a relatively new member of the collective, requested all available data. The Verdant, a plant-based species from the Outer Rim, began quietly stockpiling resources and military hardware. And most significantly, the Threll themselves, Kesha's own people, voted to begin preparation for the possibility of invasion. It was not enough. Not yet. The older species still controlled the vast majority of the collective's military resources. And 72 years was actually a very short time when you were trying to coordinate the defense of an entire region of space. Sarah found herself in an unexpected role. She became, with Zextral's guidance, the face of the warning. She recorded messages explaining human history, human resilience, human adaptability. She explained the others not as monsters but as a natural force of the universe, ancient, powerful, and utterly indifferent to the suffering they caused. She spoke of how humanity had learned to coexist with fear, to plan for impossible futures, to find meaning in the struggle itself. And something remarkable happened. Species that had never communicated with each other began to form tentative alliances. The younger civilizations, united by a desire to survive and frustration with the Council of Elders' inaction, began to organize. They requested Sarah's assistance in strategic planning. They asked her about human military tactics, about how her people had managed to resist the purification wars for decades, how they had refused to surrender even in the face of absolute defeat. And Sarah, the last human being, began to teach them. 60 years into the approaching catastrophe, the Council of Elders finally accepted reality. The others were definitely coming. 3 independent sources had confirmed it. The migration pattern was accelerating. The older species that had dominated the galaxy for millennia suddenly found themselves facing an enemy they could not simply vote away or ignore. The response, when it came, was unprecedented. For the first time in recorded history, nearly every sentient species in the Kepler Collective came together in genuine unity. Not the false unity of the Purification Wars, motivated by fear and prejudice, but true unity, born from the knowledge that survival required cooperation. And at the heart of that unity stood Commander Zextral and Dr. Sarah Chen, working side by side as the 2 architects of hope. The final decade before the others arrived was one of frantic preparation. Fleets were built, defenses were constructed, military academies were established. Scientists from 100 different species worked together to understand the others' nature, to find weaknesses in their seemingly invulnerable forms. And Sarah found herself doing something she had never expected to do again. She was helping humanity matter. Not humanity as it had been, expansionist and destructive, but humanity as it could be, adaptable, wise, and capable of seeing the best in other species when those species were willing to listen. The day the others entered the Kepler Collective's territory, every ship that could fight was ready. The combined fleet was smaller than what the Alliance commanded alone would have been, but it was more organized, more prepared, and more determined. It had been trained by a woman who understood how to fight against overwhelming odds, because her entire species had been doing exactly that for thousands of years. The first engagement lasted 17 hours. The others were devastating, as advertised. They consumed matter, they converted energy, they destroyed with an efficiency that was almost elegant in its completeness. But they had not encountered organized resistance in thousands of years. They had not expected adaptation. They had not anticipated that the smaller, younger species would understand them well enough to predict their patterns and adjust accordingly. When the dust and radiation settled, the others had taken a significant portion of the Kepler Collective's outer territories. They had consumed 3 space stations and damaged 12 capital ships. By the standards of any previous conflict, it was a catastrophic defeat. But the others had been halted. For the first time in recorded history, something had stood against them and not immediately being consumed. The psychological impact was seismic. The Alliance species who had thought the others were unstoppable began to believe they might be containable. The younger species who had been derided and ignored suddenly became valued advisors. And Sarah Chen, the last human, the representative of a species that was supposed to be extinct, found herself called the architect of the new alliance. Zextral found her on the observation deck of the Kepler 7, watching the distant stars. The battle was over. The immediate crisis had passed. But they both knew this was just the beginning, the first of many encounters that would define the next centuries. "You saved us," he said quietly, his antennae curving in a gesture that Sarah had learned meant respect and gratitude. "No," she replied, watching the distant lights. "You saved each other. I just reminded you how." "What happens now?" Zextral asked. "Will you sleep again? Will you try to find the other arcs?" Sarah smiled, and it was a sad but genuine smile. "I think I will stay awake for a while. There is still so much to learn, and so much to teach. And perhaps, just perhaps, this is what I was always meant to do. Not to rebuild humanity, but to help ensure that no species ever has to be afraid of the dark again." The room was not silent this time. It was filled with the hum of the ship, the whisper of distant communications, the ever-present sound of life continuing against the odds. And in that noise and commotion and desperate, beautiful struggle for survival, Sarah Chen finally found something that her species had been searching for since they first learned to look at the stars. She found a home.